Looking at mollusks, they're the next group on our tree. And mollusks usually have a shell. They also have a mantle and a radula, which is kind of like a head slash foot. So it's a head and foot because their nerve center is organized there. So that's where their kind of primitive brain is. However, they also use it for movement. It's most obvious on things like a snail. So you can see this is obviously the head of the animal, but it's also used as the foot, so the same muscle that's used to move around. Some of the mollusks are gastropods, and these are snails and slugs. We also have bivalves in the mollusk family, so clams, scallop, oysters, and mussels that have two shells, and they actually secrete their own shell using that mantle layer, so the layer right at the edge here that's attached to the shell, they secrete their own shell. And these are the only things that give me slight pause before I slurp them down, especially if they're being eaten raw, because bivalves, like clams and oysters and mussels, what you're eating is the entire organism. So you're eating the muscle mass, but you're also eating all of the digestive system and everything else. And these are bottom feeders. So these are eating basically whatever filters down to the bottom of wherever they're living, lakes, rivers, oceans. And so these are eating and consuming that. So when you eat the clams, oysters, and mussels, what you're getting is that partially digestive stuff in their digestive system. So it can be kind of gross, and some people do get sick from eating these different types of bivalves unless they're, I guess, caught and then allowed several days in fresh tanks, and then you get all of that kind of potentially gross stuff out of them, and it's less likely to cause people to get sick. Cephalopods are another group, and these are interesting because some of them, like the squids and octopus, their shell is just a remnant. So if you were to dissect either a squid or an octopus, you'd find kind of up here in their cap region just a very stiff rod structure, and that's all that's left of their shell, but it's internalized. Nematodes are roundworms, so you can see here's a couple of examples of the nematodes, and they're perfectly round, basically, so they get their nickname from that. These are very, very common. They are abundant in soil, so if you went out to the soil in your yard or any field, you'd probably find nematodes. Some of those are a problem for crops, and others are not. They also could be a problem for humans, so some human diseases like trichinosis can be caused by these nematodes. Something called elephantitis is also caused by nematodes. Basically what happens, these nematodes get into the body and they block the lymphatic system. The lymph system it's another type of circulatory system, but it's not the same as your blood system. Instead of using one muscle to pump the fluid around, it uses the movement of your body, so your skeletal muscles just kind of squish the fluid from around your cells around in this lymphatic system. Well, this nematode will get into the body and then clog the lymph system. So now as you're moving your legs, that fluid is no longer able to move upwards, and so the fluid moves towards gravity and it starts pooling in the legs and it causes this dramatic swelling. So I'm guessing very uncomfortable. The arthropods are the next group, and arthropods all have an exoskeleton that's composed of a molecule called chitin. And we've seen chitin before when we talked about mushrooms and different fungus. So the cell walls of mushrooms, not only in the cap, that reproductive structure above ground, but also in the hyphae down below the surface, their cell walls are all composed of chitin. So that's the same in insects. Insects also have jointed appendages, so really specialized joints. Because their skeleton's on the outside, they need to be able to move their limbs, so they have special jointed appendages to do that. And they have a segmented body. Normally they're going to have a head, thorax, and abdomen as their three main body parts. And we'll look at some different members of this group in the next couple of slides. First of all, we want to point out that arthropods are the most successful group of all animals. Even today, arthropods are our biggest competitor. They can destroy or consume as much as 20% of all of our crops in the field before we even harvest it. So they are a huge competitor with humans for food on the planet. 2/3 of all species that we have named are arthropods. 80% of those are insects, so the terms kind of become interchangeable because most of them are going to be insects. And it's estimated that at any given time on the planet, there are at least a quintillion insects alive. So they outnumber pretty much everything else combined. There's a couple main groups. We have insects, and these groups are defined by kind of the body segments and also the number of legs, things like that, and their life cycles. So we have insects, and we also have millipedes and centipedes. And the difference between our millipedes and centipedes, the millipedes are going to have multiple legs per segment. So if you looked really close at each of these segments, there are a couple of legs coming down from each segment of this millipede. Millipedes are actually pretty good as pets because they eat plant material, they'll crawl around, and I have known people that had millipedes as pets, and they're pretty cute pets. Centipedes, on the other hand, are not good pets. Centipedes are carnivores, so they are predators. They're active hunters, and if they have mouth parts big enough to bite into human tissue, then they can be lethal. So if they bite into you, and if it's a big enough centipede, they're venomous, and so they can cause lots of problems with humans as well. We have shrimp, lobsters, crabs, and barnacles are all in another group. This is why sometimes lobsters are called cockroaches of the seas, because essentially they're in the same groups. They're very closely related. Eating a lobster and eating a very large cockroach would probably be a similar experience at the table. And lobsters have the same lifestyle under the ocean, so they're scavengers. They pretty much eat whatever they can find. That's the same as cockroaches above them on land. So lobsters are the cockroach of the seas. Shrimp and crabs, again, very similar. And barnacles are interesting because as larval stages, they're free swimming. However, barnacles as adults, they settle on a surface and attach. So it's a problem for shipping industries because they constantly have to scrape barnacles off of the bottom of their boats because it creates drag in the water. They attach to docks. So they're very stationary or sessile as adults. However, that presents barnacles with some reproductive challenges. To get around that, barnacles actually have the longest phallus out of any animal on the planet. Because they're located in one spot as adults, the male has a very long phallus and will reach out and search for a receptive female with that incredibly long phallus. Their phalluses are about 23 times the length of their body. So a very long appendage so that they can accomplish reproduction. And another group includes spiders, ticks, and mites. The interesting thing I always like to point out with spiders, especially if you've noticed these in your house, if you see a spider on a windowsill and you go and get a shoe or something to squish it and it looks like it's dead already, it's kind of dry and flaky and falls apart, that wasn't actually the spider, that was an exoskeleton that was shed by the spider, and you probably have a much larger spider still crawling around your house somewhere because they have that exoskeleton. And we've seen, ticks and mites and different things before in this class. Moving on to the next group, we have echinoderms, and echinoderms include sea stars, cucumbers, urchin, and the sand dollars. If you ever looked at the beach for sand dollars, that's an echinoderm body that you're after. And these have kind of an internal structural support, and they also have spiny skin, so they don't grow by molting, they just grow continuously from the inside. They also are in the deuterostome group, so their mouths form just like ours do second, so everything prior to that was protostome. They have tube feet and a water vascular system, and basically what that means for things like the sea star is they have little tiny suctions on their underside that they're able to control. And if anybody's ever gotten to see a live sea star, sometimes aquariums will let you touch their sea stars, most of them don't, but I always, if allowed, reach underneath and pick it up underneath the sea star rather than petting the top of it, because the mouth is located at the center on the underside, And this point right at the top, where most people would be petting it in an aquarium, that's actually the anus of the organism. So I prefer to stay away from other creatures' anuses. So I, if allowed, pick it up from the bottom and hold it. And they don't hurt your hands or anything like that. But they can use those tube feet to help feed. So echinoderms, or sea stars, will eat things like clams. So if we have a clam in the ocean, so a clam is a bivalve, we have a clam in the ocean, the sea star will wrap around the top of that clam, where the opening is, and engage the water vascular system to put pressure in those tube feet to act like little suction cups. Then it starts to pry open the clam. Now, if you've ever tried to open a live clam, they're pretty strong. They can hold pretty tight, keeping their shells together. And the sea star is not strong enough to just pop it open. It can, however, get a little tiny crack opened. And what it does then is it turns its stomach inside out and inserts its stomach into that little tiny crack that it's open, and it starts digesting its meal in its own shell. And as it digests the clam, basically inside of its own shell, eventually that muscle holding it closed will break off or break down. The sea star can then pull its stomach back in and finish cleaning up its meal. So that's how they're able to eat. Looking at our last group that we're going to cover in this chapter are the chordates. And chordates can look extremely different. We'll look at some of these in the next couple of slides, but they all have some common characteristics. And these are the common characteristics. They all have a notochord, and the notochord is a rod of tissue running along the back of the organism that helps keep it straight. So in this lancet over here, the notochord runs along the back, and it's a stiff rod which keeps it straight. They also have a dorsal hollow nerve cord. So the dorsal is the back, so their nerve cord runs along the back. I don't know if you remember from earlier in the chapter, I drew my picture of something like an earthworm with its segments, and the nerve cord runs along the belly of the earthworm, not the back. So in chordates, we have the nerve cord running along the back. Also, at some point during development, we'd have pharyngeal slits, and they're still functional in the land slit. Here's our pharyngeal slits. In others, it forms the slits, and then those are later absorbed into the body and used elsewhere. So here's a mouse embryo. It would have had those slits at an early developmental point in time. So would human embryos. And also a post-anal tail. Again, at some point during development, there's a post-anal tail, and the lancet still keeps all 4 of those characteristics as an adult, and others may lose them. So most humans lose their post-anal tail before birth. Some humans are still born with tails on occasion, and there's, I believe, a video in our evolution chapter which shows a baby with a tail. The groups of chordates, there's tunicates, lancets, and vertebrates. We've looked at lancets and we pointed out the 4 structures, so our notochord, the nerve cord, the gill slits, and the post-anal tail. Tunicates have all of those characteristics, especially as larvae. So as free-swimming larvae, they have all of those, even though the adult body form is quite strange when we think of a chordate. And then vertebrates, they're very similar to our body plan, so it's easy to pick out those different characteristics on vertebrates. Looking a little bit more at vertebrates, there's a wide range of them, going all the way from something like a lamprey and increasing characteristics or changing, modifying characteristics all the way up through mammals. And an interesting thing about the vertebrate subphylum is kind of right in this transition between ray fin fishes, lobe fishes, and amphibians, in this range here, where these developed, it had to move from an aquatic environment to a land environment for those to survive. And some characteristics for adapting to moving onto land, just like the plants had to adapt to life on land. First of all, if you're no longer in the water and using gills to extract oxygen from the water, you need lungs. And fish already had swim bladders, And those early swim bladders then evolved or developed a new function as lungs. And in fact, still today, there are some fish that have lungs. That they either use them on a regular basis or they use them when they come out of the water and kind of flop across the surface to get to another small pond. So some fish still can use their swim bladders as lungs. Next, we need to fight against gravity. Once you're on land and your body's not supported, you have to hold your body up and move and fight gravity. So the lobe-finned fish has difficulty moving on land. It can't support its own body. Moving to early terrestrial vertebrates, the structure of the bones has changed quite a bit. So now they actually have basically wrists that can bend and support them. Even though it's still all encased in a fin, they now have a shoulder and wrists that they can move on land. And egg desiccation, if you are laying eggs on land, you need a tougher structure surrounding it to protect it from drying out. So eggs on land have either a leathery cover on the outside, so turtle eggs still are very leathery. You can dent them and not break them because it's kind of like a very tough leather on the outside of the eggshell, all the way to chicken eggs and ostrich eggs, which are very, very tough and stable. Looking specifically at the primates, which includes everything from lemurs all the way to humans, you can see again that's another diverse group. So your assignment for this chapter, this is due at the beginning of next class, is to go to the specimens on display in the hallway, and there are little, I believe they're orange tags attached to 9 different animals in that cupboard, so determine on the worksheet, which is in your lab manual, what letter goes with each of these different organisms, and then at least 2 characteristics that place each organism in its phyla. So for sponges, something like being heterotrophic and multicellular would work, but those characteristics would not work for the arthropods. We may want to include for the arthropods something like jointed appendages and external skeletons. And here's a summary of the whole chapter, going from very simple, developing tissues, changing the symmetry type, protostomes and deuterostomes, the type of growth. So again, review this because this is the whole chapter in a nutshell.